If you are a wrestling fan, you no doubt know of the critically acclaimed series Dark Side of the Ring on Vice TV. Season 4 is about to premiere next Tuesday, May 30th, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central on Vice TV. And to discuss it with me, joining me on the Vaqueros Cafe and Cantina hotline is the executive producer and co-creator of Dark Side of the Ring. He is Evan Husney. Follow him on Twitter at Evan Husney. Evan, how are you?
Hey, man. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. Good to be here talking with you on this.
Thanks for joining me. You have gotten this franchise has become a real juggernaut with all the different spinoffs. When you decided, you and Jason decided to start doing this documentary, did it ever occur to you how big this thing could be?
Not at all. I mean, when we started putting together the idea for, what would be Dark Side of the Ring, I mean, we actually were just focused on making one episode. We actually thought there would just be a feature-length documentary about Bruiser Brody. I mean, that was what we kind of started with, and that's all we had in mind, was just making this one documentary about Bruiser Brody. And I think along the way, as we were developing what that would be and what, Vice Land at the time, the network, wanted, we decided to kind of build it out into a whole series covering a bunch of different stories in the wrestling world. And that's kind of how we got Dark Side of the Ring. And of course, the first season. But no, never in my wildest imagination would I have thought that when we were working on that first episode, that it would be something where, by the end of this year, we'll have done 40 episodes of. I never would have thought that. Plus, notwithstanding all of the, spinoffs, of course, and never would have thought of that. I mean, we always thought that the show could exist covering other areas of interest. Like once we started to get it going, we're doing season 1 into 2. We thought, yeah, okay, comedy, that makes sense. And then other areas definitely could make sense for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been just a wildly successful venture. Your wrestling fandom, when did it start? What captured you and made you a wrestling fan?
Yeah, wrestling has kind of come in and out of my life at tons of different times. It started when I was a very little kid. I was 5 years old. And my parents, bought me the WWF, Hasbro action figures, from Toys R Us. And I just got really into the way they looked, the primary colors of, the Big Boss Man toy. I remember was probably the first one I ever got. And then eventually they started to take me to wrestling shows. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Wrestling came through a lot. WWF did, and eventually WCW Nitro did all the time. But yeah, I went to my first match when I was 5 years old, and it was during the Hulk Hogan, Sergeant Slaughter angle, where Sergeant Slaughter was the Iraqi sympathizer heel. And I also got into it because I love G.I. Joe, and Sergeant Slaughter was a big part of the G.I. Joe universe at the time. So it was kind of that crossover that really got me into it. And then flash forward to the 90s, the late 90s, when everybody was getting back into it with, the Monday Night Wars. I mean, it was hard to avoid that. I went to several Nitros. And then, of course, when I was a rabid fan in the 90s, I got exposed to ECW and started buying all the bootleg tapes. And yeah, so it's just always been a part of my childhood. And when I got around to probably about 7 or 8 years ago, it was like, okay, what do I do with this child nostalgia I have for wrestling? I really want to apply it to something that I'm, working on now. When I was producing documentaries. And so it was kind of just trying to find the perfect way to capture that, or to recapture that, I should say. And when we stumbled across, the Bruiser Brody story, that was what really captivated us, and really getting into the territory era of wrestling, all that generation of wrestling kind of before our time, and just being enraptured by those larger than life characters. And, when things were, I guess you could say more quote unquote real, when people had to live the gimmick more, stay in kayfabe, protect the business. All of that, all the high stakes of that just really fascinated us. And when we learned about how Bruiser Brody, was ultimately murdered in a locker room, and just, how, what happens when a real life crazy thing like a murder happens in a kayfabe locker room, and how does the, kind of, for lack of a better term, scripted world of wrestling sort of bleed into the real life consequences of something like a murder. And that just is what got our gears turning, was like, what if we did this documentary that was sort of a hybrid of true crime and professional wrestling? And that's what started it all. So lengthy answer there, but yeah.
No, that's good. I mean, I go back. I grew up in the the latter stages, I guess, of the territory era. So, I was
Awesome.
captivated by Mid South and World Class back in the day. Um,
Oh yeah, the best.
through the fourth season, or through the previous three seasons, and now season 4 coming up. Not to mention the series Tales from the Territories that you did with Dwayne and the Rock Johnson.
Yeah.
What's Can you think of a revelation, something you learned in doing these shows that was like the most shocking or most surprising to you?
God.
You've covered a myriad of subjects. I know, so I know it's probably hard to choose, but something that just you heard or saw and it floored you.
Man, there's a long list of those for sure. I mean, it's been this like evolutionary process making this show where we started out as fans with cameras, and we really didn't know how to interact with wrestlers, and I think it was a skill that we sort of honed as we went along, knowing the difference between being worked and trying to separate fact from fiction as best you can. It's very tricky, in the world, because I mean, wrestlers are sort of, I don't want to use the term con men, but they're sort of professional liars in a lot of ways, right? And so there's been a lot of crazy, wild things that we've learned. I think my favorite episodes of the show to work on are the ones that we kind of go in not knowing hardly anything. Most of the episodes of Dark Side are kind of these infamous, controversial stories that have kind of been around the wrestling, the smart fan bubble for decades, right? And but the ones that are more deeper cut, like for example, the Herb Abrams episode from season 2. I didn't know anything about that. I just got a tip that this was a crazy story, about a diehard wrestling fan that tried to start his own promotion, but he effectively, for lack of a better term, snorted it up his nose, the entire thing, and just of course the way he died, which was so shocking. That's probably up there, I would say, for one of the more shocking experiences, because it was just every interview was like learning, about this, doing a huge deep dive crash course into something that had never really been chronicled before. So that's one of them. I also kind of like another deep cut episode I'm pretty fond of from season 3 is the Johnny Canine Bruiser Bedlam episode, which was, again, like all we heard was this was a wrestler who at one point in his life was part of blowing up a police station in Canada, and it's like, that's a hell of a tagline. And so, again, not a story that's been chronicled that much before previously. So we went in not knowing a whole lot, and just getting to know, his widow, and a lot of the people he rode around with, a lot of the ex-biker gang guys and stuff. It was just completely eye-opening. So I think anytime when these wrestling stories kind of brush with that real life crime underworld, like, the Dino Bravo one is another good example. That's where the stakes are truly, really high, and really, really fascinating and eye-opening and fun to work on too.
Yeah, I agree. And one of my favorite episodes was Gino Hernandez back in season 1.
Yeah.
And
that too.
I watched Gino and Chris Adams as the tag team in World Class and all that good stuff. And I remember when Bill Mercer came on and announced that Gino had died.
Mm-hmm.
Debate since then has been OD or murder. Now, I'm going to be honest. I think he was murdered. Do you have an opinion one way or the other?
I do. Look, like that's a good example of another episode where I did not know a thing going in. I mean, basically, I was a diehard listener to Bruce Pritchard's podcast at that time. I mean, he was just really starting out, and the podcast was doing really, really, really well. And he had done an episode about Houston wrestling, his time working there, and talking about Gino Hernandez. And that's where I first heard this concept of like the mysterious circumstances under in which he died. Was it a murder? Was it an OD? And basically, when we were working on the show looking for episodes, we did a little research on our own, and we just kind of like winged it in terms of like, let's go down this rabbit hole and see what we're going to find. I mean, the only thing we knew was just the rumor and innuendo of that this guy could possibly be murdered. And that's a real risky thing to do, with a television budget, to go investigate this, not knowing at all what you're going to wind up with. I mean, we could have just found like that what really happened to him was pretty banal, right? And not that interesting or dramatic. But along the way, it was like the process. Every week in the office, there'd be some new bit of information. We'd reach another person. We'd uncover some weird detail, weird fact that would make and basically what we thought really happened to Gino. Like our opinions would waver week to week, you know. Um, but my personal opinion to answer your question, it's tough because I really wish that the guy in the episode whose voice is altered, you know, when he's telling he was a former kind of drug accomplice to Gino. For those who have not seen the episode, you know, he did get involved in, you know, doing some cocaine smuggling. It was very hot then in the 80s. It's a hot thing to do. But basically, his former drug runner colleague, I wish that he would have appeared on camera, and I tried to get him to, and I tried to, but the only thing we could agree on was the anonymous, keeping his anonymity and then also altering his voice, which I think makes him sound much more sinister than he really was, because at the end of the episode, the tape that Gino's mom is listening to of that guy explaining really that no, your son wasn't killed. We loved him. Yes, we were part of this criminal underworld, but we loved him and he was a great guy. Like she heard his real voice. And I think if the audience was probably able to have that same experience, I don't think that they would have walked away, or because I've heard a lot of people who still believe he was murdered. I don't think that it would have had the same effect. And plus, like I've spent time with that individual many times, like at meals, and you know, we met each other several times before he agreed to do this. And just the sense that I got was that, yeah, these guys were doing illegal stuff, but I just have a feeling that just from what I heard and the addiction, the ramping addiction that Gino had, you know, with his cocaine usage, it's kind of like this. You know, one thing about Darkseid that we've learned is like it's something that's really helped me just as a human, you know, and listening to these stories, these very tragic stories, and talking to family members. It's like I've learned so much about the grieving process, you know, through the loss of family members and loved ones. And that episode in particular was very eye-opening because it is interesting that when you catch yourself in the grieving process where it's almost harder to believe, you know, or it's easier to believe that your family member would be murdered in a drug plot, high stakes crime plot, than it would be for him as a cocaine addict to overdose. Like it's easier to believe that, you know? So that was just, I think that's what, you know, I'm very proud of with the show is that it's not just about wrestling. It also explores those very complicated emotions, you know? And I think that episode does a good job of doing that. So yeah,
it really does. It is fantastic. And again, the whole series is. Before we get into season 4, I want to touch on, you know, as I mentioned at the top, Dark Side of the Ring, you've had the spinoff to the other series, Dark Side of Comedy, Dark Side of the 90s, football. Is there a subject that you would like to do a Dark Side type documentary on?
Yes, there is one that I really do, and I think we are going to do it. It's looking very positive and very exciting, and it is not, you know, it's outside of the wrestling world. I can't say what it is right now, but one is coming. Okay, so and it may or may not be under the like Dark Side official banner, but it is very closely related, if not. Okay. So, but there is that's the only thing I can say to tease on that so far. But stay tuned for more on that.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, let's talk a little bit about season 4.
Yeah,
the list of subjects, and we saw, you know, the trailer is available on YouTube. List of subjects, and you're going to premiere with Chris Candido and Tammy.
Yeah.
One of the, you know, they were a couple in wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much of a troubled couple they were when they were still around, or when Chris was still around. Of course, we lost Chris in 2005, and since then, Tammy Sitch has had all these legal troubles and everything. What is, without giving away anything, what is something about their story that fans will see on that season premiere that will, I don't know, surprise them? Something maybe they did know about the couple.
Yeah, I mean, well, first and foremost, this story is one that we've been trying to make happen for a very long time. And going back to season 2, we really wanted to do this story because, and you know, because it is a harrowing, you know, dark story about kind of a couple that started a very young couple that got into this business. Chris was kind of born to be a wrestler in many ways. He was very passionate about wanting to be a wrestler at a very young age and was going to kind of destined to do that, to become a wrestler. And then when he met Tammy, kind of by chance, they met and they were very close. And then she kind of got swept into the wrestling business, as you'll sort of see. It wasn't her intention. She was a pre-med student, at the time. And it's just kind of this portrait of a very innocent, young, impressionable couple that kind of gets swallowed up by the business, and how they kind of sort of come out on the other end is completely so far removed from where they started, and they're in that innocence. And I think that's what's the most shocking thing sort of about it, is how they started and then where they wound up. Obviously with Chris passing at a very young age of 33 years old, I believe, and Tammy now facing potential criminal charges that are going to have her potentially in jail for a very long time, with the manslaughter situation. So it's just I think that's kind of the most intense part about it, is that. Okay. Yeah, but again, one we've tried to get off the ground many times, and now we finally pulled the trigger for season 4.
Yeah, it's gonna be great. The other subject you're gonna cover: Magnum TA, the car crash that he was in, Adrian Adonis, Doink the Clown, Junkyard Dog, Marty Jannetty. That's got to be an interesting one. I actually got to meet Marty several years ago. And he just felt like he was kind of like in the same vein as Tammy Stitch, kind of just a troubled soul that just felt just found himself in bad situations.
Yeah, I think I mean, I know it's an episode that people are really looking forward to from several different reasons. Marty Jannetty is somebody part of the Rockers, that tag team in the WWF. Such an one of the most iconic tag teams of all time. For that late 80s, early 90s era of WWF. And Marty, someone who kind of took this ride to becoming, at the peak of WWF, and then falling so far after that tag team sort of broke up, and trying to find his own identity to kind of recapture that same sense of stardom that he once had. I think has been a very difficult adjustment for him. And I think we tried to get to the heart of, for lack of a better term, Marty's trauma, because there is a lot of that he has suffered, and he's been in and out of jail many times. He's had a lot of various drug problems, and he's always kind of in and out of trouble, for lack of a better term. And so we wanted to look into that and to create really a portrait of him. But also it seems like through his experience with wrestling, he sort of created this semi-fabricated world of fantasy world that he's kind of living in terms of how, what he puts out on social media, and still trying to kind of, perpetuate a sense of relevance, now that he's not in the spotlight. And so I think the episode is aptly titled, which we titled it "The World According to Marty Jannetty." And I think it just deep dives into, again, the struggles a lot of people have with that sort of post-wrestling life. And I think that episode is really, going to get into that. And it's quite memorable. And hey, it's, there's a lot of unfortunate, untimely deaths in wrestling, and which has led to a majority of our episodes chronicling the stories of people who are no longer here. It's always great to work with somebody who still is here, who can tell their own story in their own words. And so we're very fortunate we were able to do that with Marty.
Absolutely. I mean, it's going to be a great series. You also got, you're also going to talk about Bam Bam Bigelow, Abdullah the Butcher, Bash at the Beats 2000, and the Graham family. All in all, a great season 4 that starts next Tuesday, May 30th, Dark Side of the Ring, May 30th, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. Catch it on Vice TV. He is the co-creator and executive producer for Dark Side of the Ring, Evan Husney. Follow him on Twitter at Evan Husney. Evan, I appreciate this, man. I'm looking forward to the season. All the best to you, all the success in the world, and hope to talk again soon.
Thanks so much, Stuart. I really appreciate it.